To avoid a scandal, the millionaire says his maid is his fiancée, but the feelings become real. The flash of the cameras exploded like thunder at the exact moment that Cameron Hayes stumbled out of the exclusive Velvet Dreams Club in Manhattan with Natalie Parker in his arms. The billionaire CEO of Hayes Technologies was visibly upset, and his housekeeper was desperately trying to keep him upright as the paparazzi swarmed around him like vultures. "Mr. Hayes, please let me help you into the car," Natalie whispered, feeling her own stomach churn not from the drink, but from the secret she had been carrying for exactly 4 weeks. Cameron, with his messy brown hair and loose tie, pulled Natalie closer, making her freeze. The photographers intensified their frantic clicking, capturing every second of the compromising moment. Natalie's face burned with embarrassment as she tried to discreetly pull herself away. "Nat, you're the only one who really cares," Cameron muttered, loud enough for the nearest reporters to hear. His breath had a slight hint of whiskey, but his blue-gray eyes held a surprising clarity. One of the reporters, Marcus Reynolds from TMZ, approached with his microphone. "Mr. Hayes, are the rumors about your romance with the housekeeper true?" It was at that moment that Cameron did something that would change their lives forever. With an enigmatic smile, he turned to the cameras and declared, "Romance? No, Fintlimen. Natalie Parker is my fiancée." Natalie's world collapsed in that instant. Her pale face contrasted with her red hair, and she felt her legs go weak. Cameron's words triggered an even more intense storm of flashes, and the questions started raining down like hail. "Since when? When is the wedding? Isn't that against company policy?" Natalie felt Cameron's strong arm around her waist, guiding her firmly into the waiting limousine. When the door closed, isolating them from the chaos outside, she was finally able to breathe. "Have you gone completely mad?" she whispered, her green eyes sparking with anger. Cameron loosened his tie even more and leaned back in the leather seat. It was either that or let them speculate about a scandalous affair between boss and maid. "Believe me, it's better for your reputation." "My reputation?" Natalie laughed humorlessly. "You've just announced a fake engagement to the whole world." The driver discreetly began the journey to the Hayes mansion on the Upper East Side, while Natalie tried to process the madness of the situation. At 28, she had built a structured and discreet life. She had been working as a housekeeper at the Hayes mansion for 3 years, saving up to fulfill her dream of opening a small bookshop. Now, in a matter of minutes, her plans were in jeopardy. Cameron, at 34, was known as much for his business genius as for his appearances in the social columns. After transforming the family business into a tech empire, he had become one of New York's most sought-after bachelors. And now, apparently, he was engaged to his housekeeper. "Look, Natalie," Cameron leaned forward, looking more sober. "We can make this work. It will be temporary, a few months of public courtship, then an amicable breakup. You'll receive generous compensation, of course." Natalie felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the absurd proposal. Her hand instinctively rested on her still flat belly. The baby she was carrying was the result of a single night with Michael Bennett, an editor she had met in a cafe 3 months ago. He had disappeared before she had even discovered her pregnancy. "I can't do that, Mr. Hayes," she whispered. "Cameron," he corrected. "If we're going to be engaged, you need to call me Cameron." His characteristic smile faltered as he noticed her pallor. "Are you all right?" The limousine came to a gentle stop in front of the brownstone mansion. Through the wrought iron gates, Natalie could see the garden lights illuminating the property she knew so well. It was her refuge, her workplace, and now it looked like a gilded prison. "I need to think," she finally said, getting out of the car before he could reply. As she climbed the stairs to her room on the 3rd floor, Natalie checked her phone. The news was already on all the gossip sites. Her photo with Cameron outside the club was in the spotlight, and speculation about the housekeeper's fairy tale was multiplying. In her modest but comfortable room, Natalie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. A sham marriage could be just what she needed to protect her privacy during her pregnancy. When the farce was over, she could quietly disappear with her baby, preserving her dignity and that of her child. Downstairs, Cameron went into his office, poured himself a glass of water, and began to formulate a plan. He had known Natalie for years, and trusted her more than anyone else. Her commitment to her work, her discreet intelligence, and her natural compassion had always impressed him. What had started out as an impulsive solution to avoid a scandal was slowly turning into something more in his mind. The Manhattan moon shone through the mansion's tall windows, illuminating two lonely hearts who, without knowing it, were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever. Natalie, protecting a secret that was growing inside her, and Cameron, discovering that his feelings for the housekeeper were perhaps deeper than he had ever imagined. The next morning, Natalie woke up to the insistent sound of notifications on her cell phone. Dozens of unread messages flashed across the screen, including 5 missed calls from her sister Rachel. The reality of the night before hit her like a punch in the gut when she saw her photo with Cameron splashed across the front page of the New York Post with the headline, "The Prince of Tech meets his Cinderella." "This can't be happening," she muttered, running her fingers through her tousled red hair. The digital clock read 6:45, 15 minutes before his usual time to start his duties at the mansion. Opening the door to her room, Natalie found Gloria, the middle-aged cook who had worked for the Hayes for decades, standing in the hallway with an expression that mixed shock and curiosity. "Darling, why didn't you tell me?" Gloria asked, her hands holding a breakfast tray that was certainly not part of her normal routine. Natalie began, but was interrupted by the sound of heels rapidly ascending the stairs. Regina Hayes, Cameron's mother, appeared in the hallway like a hurricane in a flawless Chanel ensemble. Her blue eyes, identical to her son's, sparkled with a mixture of indignation and incredulity. "Natalie, darling, we need to talk," Regina declared, dismissing Gloria with an elegant gesture. In the library. Now, Natalie's heart raced. In 3 years working at the mansion, she had learned to navigate Regina Hayes' strong personality. But this was uncharted territory. She followed the matriarch through corridors decorated with expensive works of art, feeling like a prisoner on her way to court. In the library, Cameron was already waiting, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, showing no sign of the previous night's drinking. When he saw Natalie in her simple cotton robe, something in his eyes softened. "Mom, I can explain," Cameron began, but Regina held up a hand, silencing him. "Explain? How do you explain announcing an engagement to our housekeeper without even consulting me?" Regina sat down in one of the leather armchairs, her posture rigid. "The board is already in an uproar. The company's shares dropped 2 points this morning." Natalie felt her stomach turn, a combination of morning sickness and anxiety. "Ms. Hayes, please, Natalie," Regina interrupted, her voice softer now. "If you're really going to be my daughter-in-law, I guess you can call me Regina." Cameron wiped his hand across his face, a gesture Natalie recognized as a sign of stress. "Mom, we meant to tell you in a more appropriate way." "Well, now we need a plan," Regina declared, picking up her iPad. "I have Lawrence, our press officer, organizing a press conference for this afternoon. We need to present a convincing story about how you fell in love." Natalie sat down, feeling her legs go weak. The mention of falling in love made her stomach do another flip, reminding her of the real secret she was carrying. "You met here, of course," Regina continued, typing notes. "A discreet romance that blossomed naturally." "Cameron, darling, why are you so pale?" Cameron had just received a message on his cell phone. His normally controlled face showed concern. "Michael Bennett is in reception. He says he needs to speak to Natalie urgently." Natalie's world stopped. Michael Bennett, the father of her unborn child, was there. After 3 months of silence, he had chosen just this moment to appear. "Who was Michael Bennett?" Regina asked, her voice as sharp as a blade. "An editor at Random House," Cameron replied, his eyes fixed on Natalie, who had lost all color. "And apparently he knows my fiancée." Natalie stood up abruptly, feeling the room spin. I need a minute." Cameron caught up with her before she reached the door, holding her arm gently. "Are you okay? You look like you're going to faint." His touch was warm and comforting, completely different from the professional coldness they had always maintained. For a moment, Natalie allowed herself to lean on him, inhaling the soft scent of his expensive cologne. "I can't see him," she whispered, just for Cameron to hear. "Please." Something in the vulnerability of her voice must have touched Cameron, because his eyes softened even more. "Leave it to me," he said. And for the first time since all the madness had started, Natalie felt that perhaps she wasn't completely alone. Regina watched the interaction with growing interest, her years of experience at social events allowing her to realize that there was much more to the story than met the eye. "Lawrence will be arriving in an hour," she announced, standing up. "I suggest you use this time to line up your stories. And Natalie, dear, dress appropriately. From now on, you're a Hayes." When Regina left, leaving him alone in the library, silence hung between them. Cameron was still holding Natalie's arm, his thumb unconsciously making small circles on her skin. "Who was he really?" Cameron asked softly. Natalie felt tears forming in her eyes. "Someone I'd rather forget," she replied, her voice trembling. "Please don't make me talk about it now." Cameron nodded, respecting her silence. "I'll take care of it, but at some point, we need to talk about what's really going on here." As she watched him leave the library to deal with Michael Bennett, Natalie realized that she was entering a much more complicated game than she had imagined. Her secret, Michael's sudden presence, the warmth of Cameron's touch on her arm, all blended into a web of complications that threatened to suffocate her. But while one hand rested protectively on her belly, the other still felt the residual warmth of Cameron's touch. And for the first time in weeks, Natalie allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Cameron met Michael Bennett in the mansion's elegant lobby, his athletic build contrasting with the editor's more delicate figure. Michael looked nervous, constantly adjusting his thin-rimmed glasses as he waited. "Mr. Bennett," Cameron greeted with calculated coolness. "I am Comet on the Fiancée. I understand you wish to speak to my fiancée." Michael visibly paled when he heard the word fiancée. "Fiancée? But that's not possible. I need to speak to Natalie urgently. It's a private matter." "Any matter relating to Natalie goes through me now," Cameron replied, his voice maintaining a controlled tone that masked his growing irritation. Something about Michael's behavior bothered him deeply. Upstairs, Natalie was sitting on her bed, her hands shaking as she held up the results of the blood test that confirmed her pregnancy. Gloria had brought her some ginger tea, worried about her pallor, unaware that the discomfort went far beyond the stress of the situation. The sound of heels in the hallway announced the arrival of Regina, who entered the room without knocking. "Darling, we need to start your transformation. Lawrence will be here in 40 minutes, and you need to look like the proper bride for a Hayes." Regina opened Natalie's closet, critically examining the simple, functional clothes. "This just won't do." Caroline, her personal assistant, called into the phone. "Bring the selection from Burdorf's immediately." Meanwhile, in the lobby, the tension between Cameron and Michael was rising. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, my issue with Natalie is extremely personal and precedent to your arrangement." "Precedent?" Cameron arched an eyebrow, his protective instinct intensifying. "Explain yourself." Michael hesitated, running a hand through his messy brown hair. "Natalie and we had a relationship a few months ago. I made a mistake by disappearing, but now I need to make things right." In the bedroom, Natalie watched Caroline, Regina's assistant, unpack sophisticated dresses and designer shoes. Regina supervised everything with a critical eye, occasionally consulting her iPad where Lawrence sent instructions for the press conference. "The story goes like this," Regina explained. "You got close during the evenings when Cameron worked late. You brought him tea in the office, talked about literature. I know you're an avid reader, dear." And love blossomed naturally. Natalie felt a twinge in her chest. The fictional story wasn't that far from reality. She really did used to bring Cameron tea during her evenings at work, and they would occasionally discuss the books she organized in the mansion's library. Downstairs, Cameron was about to lose his usual composure. "Mr. Bennett, I suggest that any outstanding issues with Natalie be dealt with through the Hayes family lawyers." "Lawyers?" Michael gulped. "Look, Mr. Hayes, there's something you need to know about Natalie." At that moment, Cameron's phone vibrated with an urgent message from his financial director about the fall in the company's shares. The pressure of the outside world was beginning to seep into the bubble he had created. Back in her room, Natalie was now wearing an elegant navy blue Carolina Herrera dress that Regina had selected. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman she'd barely recognized. Sophisticated, elegant, worthy of being a Hayes. Perfect, Regina smiled satisfied. Now about the ring, already arranged, Cameron's voice sounded from the doorway, surprising them all. He entered the room, ignoring Caroline's protests about tradition and luck. In his hand, a small blue velvet box from Tiffany. Natalie's heart raced as Cameron approached. There was something different in his gaze, an intensity she had never noticed before. He opened the box, revealing a dazzling platinum ring with a solitaire diamond. "I hope you like it," he said softly, sliding the ring on her finger. The contact of their hands sent a shiver down Natalie's spine. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Excellent," Regina declared, breaking the moment. "Lawrence has just arrived. Let's go downstairs for the press conference. Remember, you're in love, but keep a low profile." As they descended the stairs, Cameron held Natalie's elbow gently. "Michael Bennett's gone," he informed her in a low voice. "But something tells me he'll be back. We need to talk about it later." Natalie nodded, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger and the even greater weight of the secret in her belly. The living room of the mansion had been transformed into a makeshift press room, with chairs arranged in rows and a small pulpit. Lawrence, a middle-aged man with a shrewd expression, was waiting for them with a professional smile, ready to present the couple of the year to the world. Natalie felt Cameron squeeze her hand lightly, a silent gesture of support. She took a deep breath, knowing she was about to dive even deeper into this web of lies. But as the flashbulbs began to flash through the mansion's windows, she realized that her biggest lie wasn't the fake engagement, but the secret she was carrying, a secret that would soon be impossible to hide. The reporters began to enter the room, and Natalie felt Cameron's arm wrap around her waist protectively. For a moment, lost in the warmth of his touch and the sparkle of the ring on her finger, she could almost believe the farce they were about to present to the world. The press conference went like a well-rehearsed play. Cameron and Natalie, sitting side by side on the small makeshift stage in the Hayes mansion, played the part of the couple in love with a conviction that surprised even Regina, who was watching intently from the front row. "Ms. Parker," a Wall Street Journal reporter raised her hand. "How was the transition from housekeeper to fiancée of one of the most powerful men in New York?" Natalie felt the subtle grip of Cameron's hand on hers. The engagement ring caught a reflection of light, reminding her of the magnitude of the farce they were staging. "Actually," she began, her voice firmer than she expected, "there wasn't exactly a transition. Cameron and I," she hesitated for a moment, meeting his eyes, "we got closer naturally over time. The title of my job never defined our connection." Lawrence, the press officer, smiled discreetly. The answer was perfect, romantic enough to satisfy the tabloids, but professional enough to calm worried investors. After the press conference, as the reporters were politely ushered out of the mansion, Natalie felt a familiar wave of nausea. Disguised, she made her way to the nearest restroom, closing the door quietly behind her. Cameron, who had noticed her hurried exit, followed her worriedly. "Natalie," he called softly through the door. "Are you all right?" "Just a moment," she replied, her voice trembling. When she finally emerged, she was even paler than usual. Cameron took her by the elbow, guiding her up to his private office on the second floor. "I think we need to have that conversation now," he said, closing the door. "And it has something to do with Michael Bennett, doesn't it?" Natalie sank into one of the leather armchairs, feeling the weight of all her secrets. Cameron's office had always been her favorite place in the mansion. The walls filled with books, the scent of coffee and leather, the view of the manicured garden. Now it felt like a confessional. "I met Michael 3 months ago," she began, her hands intertwining nervously in her lap. "It was in a coffee shop near the bookstore where I used to work on Saturdays. He was charming, interesting. We had a few dates, and Cameron encouraged gently, taking a seat in the armchair next to her instead of behind his imposing desk. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, the words finally escaping her lips. "Michael disappeared before I found out. Today was the first time I've seen him since." The silence that followed seemed deafening. Cameron stood up, walking over to the window. Natalie watched his silhouette against the afternoon light, trying to decipher his reaction. "That's why you agreed to carry on with this farce," he concluded, turning to face her. "To protect your privacy during your pregnancy." Natalie nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm Soda. I know this complicates everything. If you want to cancel—" "No," Cameron interrupted her, his voice surprisingly soft. "I'm not going to let you face this alone. The story of our engagement can protect not only you, but also your baby from any media speculation." He sat back down, taking her hands between his. "But does Michael know?" "No, not that he'd blade. And honestly, I don't know if I want him to know." He made it very clear that he wasn't looking for anything serious when he disappeared. Cameron processed the information in silence. His analytical mind was already beginning to formulate plans and contingencies. "We need to modify our story slightly," he finally said. "We'll say that our relationship started longer ago, discreetly. That will explain the pregnancy when it becomes apparent." Natalie stared at him, surprised at his practicality and willingness to help her. "Why are you doing this, Cameron? Why do you care so much?" He hesitated, his thumb tracing unconscious circles on her palm. "Because you've been more than an employee to me for a long time, Natalie. You're the person who knows all my habits, who knows when I need coffee or silence. You've been organizing my life for 3 years, and you do it with a dedication that goes beyond the professional." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Regina entered, her keen eyes catching the couple's joined hands before they could separate. "Lawrence is pleased with the outcome of the press conference," she announced. "The shares have already started to recover. But we have another matter to discuss: the engagement dinner." Natalie felt her stomach churn again, this time with anxiety. Regina continued. "It's next Saturday at the Metropolitan Club. 300 guests, selected press. Caroline's already taking care of her closet, darling." "Mom," Cameron intervened, sensing Natalie's discomfort. "Maybe something more intimate." "Impossible," Regina cut in. "The Hayes have always celebrated their engagements with grandeur. It's tradition." When Regina left, leaving a list of social engagements they would need to fulfill over the next few days, Natalie felt the weight of reality on her shoulders. Cameron approached, placing his hands on her tense shoulders. "One step at a time," he murmured. "We're in this together now." The afternoon sun cast golden shadows through the office windows, illuminating Natalie's face as she looked at Cameron. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that went beyond the usual kindness. Something that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with his condition or the farce they were living. "Together," she repeated softly. And for a moment, the words seemed to carry a much deeper meaning than either of them was prepared to admit. The engagement dinner was fast approaching, and the Hayes mansion had been transformed into a frenetic operations center. Regina commanded an army of event planners, decorators, and advisors, while Caroline ran back and forth with fabric samples and floral arrangements. Natalie watched everything from her new bedroom in the east wing of the mansion, a luxurious suite that Regina had insisted she occupy, claiming that a future Hayes couldn't stay in the servants' quarters. The walls in soft shades of cream and the privileged view of the garden contrasted drastically with her old function room. "We need to practice one more time," Cameron declared, entering the room after knocking lightly on the door. He carried a folder with the information Lawrence had prepared, their carefully constructed love story, with dates and details they needed to memorize. "How did we meet?" he asked, taking a seat in the armchair by the window. Natalie sighed, reciting the rehearsed story. "You were working late at the office, as usual. I brought you some chamomile tea, because I'd noticed you were having trouble sleeping. We talked about The Great Gatsby, which you were rereading, and you mentioned that Fitzgerald had a distorted view of true love," Cameron added, genuine smile appearing on his lips. "That part, at least, is true." Natalie blushed slightly, remembering the real argument they'd had months ago. "Yes, well, some of the best lies contain fragments of truth." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of Regina giving instructions downstairs. Cameron watched Natalie for a moment, noticing how she unconsciously stroked her still imperceptible belly. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. "The nausea is a little better," she replied, grateful for the genuine concern in his voice. Gloria has been making ginger tea every morning, although she thinks it's just stress. We need to tell her, Cameron suggested. And my mother, especially before the engagement dinner. We don't want you to get sick in the middle of it. Natalie nodded, feeling the weight of the engagement ring on her finger. It was surreal how, in just a few days, her life had changed so drastically. Michael hadn't tried to contact her again since his visit, but she knew it was only a matter of time. Cameron, she began hesitantly, what if Michael decides to tell the truth to the press? He stood up, approaching her with a determined expression. Leave Michael to me. I already have people investigating his past and his connections. If he tries anything, we'll be ready. The sound of approaching heels alerted them seconds before Regina entered the room, followed by a stylist carrying several dresses. Natalie, darling, we need to decide on your dress for dinner, Regina announced, her shrewd eyes noticing the proximity between her son and the bride. Cameron, can you excuse us? Women's business. Before leaving, Cameron surprised everyone, including himself, by leaning over to place a soft kiss on Natalie's forehead. The gesture, although part of the act, sent a shiver down her spine. Over the next hour, Natalie tried on several dresses under Regina's critical eye. Finally, an emerald green Valentino model was chosen, elegant enough for the occasion, but with a cut that would subtly disguise any changes in her body over the coming weeks. Natalie, Regina said softly when they were alone. Is there something you and Cameron aren't telling me? Natalie's heart raced. Regina, you're pregnant, aren't you? The shock must have been visible on her face, because Regina smiled knowingly. Darling, I've raised 3 children. I recognize the signs. The morning sickness, the pallor, the way you avoid certain scents. Natalie felt tears forming in her eyes. I'm sorry, don't be sorry, Regina surprised her, holding her hands. A baby is always a blessing, and it explains the haste of this engagement, although I suspect there's more to this story than you're telling me. At that moment, Natalie saw beyond the facade of the perfectly composed socialite. She saw a woman who, despite her demands and high standards, had a strong maternal heart. I promise I'll tell you everything soon, Natalie whispered. But please, your secret is safe with me, Regina assured her. Now, let's make some adjustments to this dress to ensure that you look absolutely stunning on Saturday. When Regina left, Natalie allowed herself a moment's reflection in front of the mirror. The green dress highlighted her eyes and pale skin. And for the first time since all the madness had started, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if everything were real. The engagement, Cameron's love, the family they were pretending to be. The sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, casting golden shadows through the mansion's windows. In his office, Cameron reviewed documents related to Michael Bennett, his heart torn between protecting Natalie and a deeper emotion he was beginning to recognize, but wasn't yet ready to name. The engagement dinner was approaching, and with it, the need to make his performance even more convincing. What neither of them had yet realized was that sometimes the best performances are those that contain more truth than fiction. The Metropolitan Club shone in the golden light of the early Saturday evening. The main hall, with its crystal chandeliers and ornate columns, had been transformed into a fairy tale setting for Cameron Hayes and Natalie Parker's engagement dinner. Natalie watched her reflection in the mirror of the luxurious ladies' room, tried to control the nausea that threatened to ruin her perfectly applied makeup. The emerald green Valentino dress hugged her curves delicately, hiding any hint of her condition. Take a deep breath. Regina came up behind her, offering a small bottle of aromatic salts. It worked perfectly during my 3 pregnancies. Thank you, Natalie whispered, grateful for the Hayes matriarch's silent support. In recent days, Regina had become an unexpected ally, shielding her from inconvenient questions and discreetly adjusting the menu to accommodate her morning sickness. Outside, the buzz of the 300 guests was growing. The cream of New York society was present: CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and of course, the carefully selected press. Cameron was waiting in the hallway when Natalie emerged from the bathroom. His Tom Ford tuxedo made him look even more elegant than usual, and something in his gaze made her heart skip a beat. You look stunning, he murmured, offering his arm. Ready as I can be. she replied, entwining her arm in his. As they walked towards the main hall, Cameron leaned in slightly. Michael Bennett is here. Natalie froze for a moment, but kept the social smile on her face. How? Apparently, he got an invitation through his contacts at the publishing house, Cameron explained, his voice tense. Don't worry, I got people keeping an eye on him. Before they could argue any further, Lawrence appeared, signaling that it was time for his official entrance. The salon's double doors opened, and all eyes turned to the couple. The dinner went like an elaborate play. Natalie and Cameron played the part of the couple in love to perfection, exchanging affectionate glances and subtle touches that seemed natural even to the most skeptical observers. During the main toast, Cameron surprised everyone, especially Natalie, with a seemingly impromptu speech. When Natalie came into my life 3 years ago, he began, his voice carrying an emotion that didn't seem rehearsed. She brought order to my chaos. Not just by organizing my schedule or my home, but by bringing light to my darkest days. She has the rare gift of seeing beyond appearances, of finding beauty in the little things. Natalie felt tears forming in her eyes, moved not only by the words, but by the sincerity she detected in them. And now, Cameron continued, holding her hand, she's given me the greatest gift of all, the chance to build a family. A murmur of approval ran through the room, while Regina smiled discreetly, knowing the double meaning of those words. The music began to play, and Cameron led Natalie onto the dance floor. As they waltzed, she noticed Michael Bennett watching them from a corner of the room, his face a mask of conflict. He's not going to give up easily, Natalie whispered against Cameron's shoulder. Neither will I, he replied, surprising her with the intensity of his statement. The evening progressed, and Natalie began to feel the fatigue of pregnancy weighing on her shoulders. Cameron, noticing her signs of exhaustion, discreetly began to say goodbye to the guests. That's when Michael took advantage of a moment when Cameron was distracted to approach Natalie. We need to talk, he whispered urgently. About the baby. Natalie's blood ran cold. Al, please, Michael insisted. 5 minutes is all I asked. Before she could reply, she felt Cameron's protective arm around her waist. Is there a problem, love? He asked, his eyes fixed on Michael. Mr. Hayes, Michael began, but was interrupted by Regina, who appeared as if by magic beside them. Natalie, darling, Alexander Vanderbilt is absolutely delighted with you and insists on arranging lunch, Regina interjected gently, but with enough authority to dispel any attempt at confrontation. Michael stepped back, realizing he was at a disadvantage, but the look he threw Natalie made it clear that this conversation was only the beginning. Later, as the limousine drove them back to the Hayes mansion, Natalie finally allowed her defenses to drop. He knows, she whispered, the tears finally escaping. Michael knows about the baby. Cameron pulled her close, allowing her to rest her head on his shoulder. How? He must have found out from some contact at the hospital where I did the tests, she explained, her voice trembling. What are we going to do? Cameron's use of let's didn't go unnoticed. He intertwined his fingers with hers, the engagement ring sparkling under the city lights that passed by the window. We're going to protect you in this baby, he declared with a certainty that warmed her heart. As for Michael Bennett, leave him to me. When they arrived at the mansion, Cameron insisted on accompanying Natalie to her room. At the door, she hesitated before entry. Cameron, she began, turning to face him. Thank you. For everything. Your speech tonight. Every word was true, he interrupted her softly, surprising them both with his honesty. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a gaze that said more than any words could express. Cameron leaned in slightly, as if to kiss her, but stopped inches from her lips. Good night, Natalie, he whispered, pulling away with visible reluctance. As she closed the door, they both realized that the line between reality and acting was becoming increasingly blurred, and neither of them was sure they wanted to keep it intact. The sun had barely risen when Natalie found Gloria in the kitchen of the Hayes mansion, preparing an infusion of ginger and chamomile. The cook smiled knowingly, pushing the steaming cup towards her. It's normal, dear. With my 3 children, the first few months were the hardest, Gloria commented casually, turning her attention to the pancake batter she was preparing. Natalie froze with her cup halfway to her lips. How? 30 years working in this house has taught me to observe, Gloria replied with a gentle smile. And Regina isn't the only one who knows how to recognize the signs of a pregnancy. Before Natalie could reply, Cameron entered the kitchen, already impeccably dressed for work. His eyes softened as he met Natalie's, and he leaned over to kiss her forehead, a gesture that was becoming surprisingly natural. "We have a situation," he murmured against her hair. Michael Bennett gave an interview to Page 6. Natalie's stomach churned, and it wasn't because of her pregnancy. Gloria discreetly left the kitchen, leaving them alone. "What did he say?" Natalie asked, her voice trembling slightly. Cameron picked up his tablet, displaying the headline. Hayes' fiancée's ex-lover promises bombshell revelations about couple's relationship. "He can't," Natalie began, but was interrupted by the sound of rapidly approaching heels. Regina entered the kitchen like a controlled hurricane, her face a mask of professional determination. "Lawrence is already preparing an announcement. Cameron, you have that meeting with the Chinese investors in an hour. Natalie, darling, you're coming with me." "Mom," Cameron tried to intervene, but Regina held up a hand. "Trust me, son. I know exactly how to handle this." Regina led Natalie to her personal office, an elegant space decorated in shades of ivory and gold. To Natalie's surprise, Gloria was already there, pouring more tea. "Now," Regina began, taking a seat in her leather armchair, "let's discuss how to protect you and my grandson." Natalie felt tears forming. "Regina, darling, you don't have to explain. What matters is that you're carrying a Hayes, regardless of the circumstances of conception." Gloria nodded in agreement, placing a comforting hand on Natalie's shoulder. "This family protects its own." "But Michael," Natalie began. "Michael Bennett," Regina pronounced the name as if it were something unpleasant, "is a junior editor with considerable debts and an ex-wife who is suing him for child support arrears. Information that, coincidentally, might interest the press more than their supposed revelations about you." Natalie blinked, surprised at Regina's efficiency. "How do you?" "I have my resources," Regina smiled, a gesture that was very reminiscent of Cameron. "Now, about the official announcement. We're going to confirm your previous relationship with Bennett, but emphasize that it was something brief and unimportant, long before you and Cameron fell in love." "What about the baby?" Natalie asked, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. "In a few weeks, we'll announce that you and Cameron are expecting your first child. The timing will be perfect. A low-key romance that blossomed naturally, a romantic engagement, and the happy discovery of a baby on the way." Gloria poured more tea, adding, "No one will question the dates when they see how Mr. Cameron looks at you." Natalie blushed intensely. "What do you mean?" Regina and Gloria exchanged meaningful glances. "Darling," Regina said softly, "my son may have started this as a farce to protect his reputation, but the way he's been acting, well, let's just say that even Cameron Hayes isn't that good an actor." Before Natalie could process this information, her phone vibrated with a message from Cameron. "What's up? I can cancel the meeting if you need me." The genuine concern in his words made her heart race. Regina, who had noticed his expression, smiled knowingly. "Answer that everything is under control," she instructed. "Now, on to the practical details. Gloria, you will continue to prepare the special meals for Natalie. I've also made an appointment with Dr. Madison Park. She's the best obstetrician in Manhattan, and more importantly, extremely discreet." The rest of the morning passed in a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. When Cameron finally returned from the meeting, he found Natalie in the back garden, sitting on her favorite bench under the century-old oak tree. "How are you really?" he asked, taking a seat next to her. "Honestly, overwhelmed. Your mother is a force of nature." Cameron laughed softly. "Good thing she's on her side then." The hour made Natalie look at him curiously. In the light filtered through the oak leaves, Cameron looked different, more vulnerable, more real. "About what Michael said," she began. "It doesn't matter," Cameron interrupted her gently. "What matters is that you and the baby are okay. The rest we'll sort out together." Natalie felt something change between them at that moment. A subtle but significant change, as if the farce they were living was beginning to dissolve into something more real. "Cameron," she whispered, "why are you doing all this?" He was silent for a moment, his fingers finding hers on the bench. Because maybe this lie has made me see a truth that was right in front of me all along. The morning after the confrontation with Michael Bennett, the routine of the Hayes mansion was interrupted by a notification from TMZ. The website had published old photos of Natalie and Michael together in a cafe, accompanied by insinuations about the true nature of her relationship with Cameron. "Ignore your phone today," Cameron advised over breakfast. Noticing how Natalie anxiously glanced at the screen of her cell phone with each notification. Lawrence is taking care of everything. But it wasn't just the media that worried Natalie. Her first appointment with Dr. Madison Park was scheduled for that afternoon, and the prospect of making her pregnancy even more real, even more documented, made her nervous. "I'm coming with you," Cameron declared when he caught her looking at her watch for the third time. It wasn't a question. "You don't have to," she protested weakly. "You've got that board meeting. That can wait," he added, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that was becoming familiar. "This is more important." Dr. Park's office occupied an entire floor in a discreet building on the Upper East Side. The soft-tone decor and the absence of other patients, Regina had guaranteed total privacy for the appointment, created a welcoming atmosphere. "Ms. Parker, Mr. Hayes," Dr. Park greeted them with a professional smile. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with a maternal air that immediately made Natalie feel more relaxed. During the initial examination, Cameron stayed by Natalie's side, holding her hand while the doctor asked questions about her symptoms and family history. When it came time for the ultrasound, Natalie felt her heart racing. "Here it is," Dr. Park announced, turning the monitor so they could both see. "Your baby is approximately 12 weeks along, and as far as I can see, he's perfectly healthy." Natalie held her breath as she saw the small shape on the screen. Cameron squeezed her hand gently, and when she looked at him, she was surprised to see his eyes watering. "Do you want to hear the heart?" the doctor asked. The rhythmic, accelerated sound filled the room, and Natalie couldn't hold back the tears. Cameron leaned over, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made her heart race almost as fast as the baby's. "I'll leave you two alone for a moment," Dr. Park said quietly, leaving the room. "It's real," Natalie whispered, still staring at the screen. "There's a real baby in there." Cameron wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "A baby that's going to get all the love and protection we can give it." The certainty in his voice made Natalie look at him curiously. "Why do you care so much, Cameron? This baby isn't even mine," he added softly. "Maybe not biologically. But over the last few days, I've been thinking a lot about family, about what really matters. And I realized that I want this. I want you and this baby in my life, not just as part of a hoax for the media." The monitor still showed the image of the baby, its heart beating steadily and strongly, as if marking the rhythm of a new story that was just beginning. "What are you saying?" Natalie asked, barely daring to breathe. "I'm saying that maybe we needed this lie to see the truth," Cameron replied, his free hand caressing her cheek. "That maybe I was in love with you a long time ago, but I was too busy being your boss to realize it." Before Natalie could reply, Dr. Park returned with some instructions in prenatal vitamins. The moment had passed, but something fundamental had changed between them. On the way back to the mansion, the silence in the car was heavy with unspoken words and newfound feelings. The driver discreetly kept the partition closed, giving them privacy. "About what you said in the office," Natalie began. "Every word was true," Cameron interrupted her gently. "But I don't want you to feel pressured. You have enough to deal with right now." Natalie looked out of the window, watching the familiar streets of Manhattan go by. Her hand unconsciously rested on her belly, where the first photo of her son lay inside an envelope. "What if I told you I had feelings for you too?" she whispered, so low that for a moment she thought he hadn't heard. Cameron took her free hand, interlacing their fingers. "Then I'd say that maybe this farce was the best mistake we ever made." When they arrived at the mansion, Regina was waiting for them in the entrance hall, her expression a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Cameron silently handed her the envelope with the ultrasound, and the matriarch's eyes filled with tears as she saw the first image of her grandson. "Is everything all right?" she asked, looking from one to the other. "Yes," Cameron replied, his arm wrapping around Natalie's waist protectively. Everything's perfectly fine. And for the first time since all the madness had started, Natalie realized that maybe he was right. Perhaps, amidst all the lies and complications, they had accidentally stumbled upon the most important truth of all, that sometimes love is born in the most unexpected places, and that family is much more than blood ties. The revelation of Cameron and Natalie's feelings brought a new dynamic to the Hayes mansion, but it also attracted unwanted attention. The headlines about the alleged love triangle involving Michael Bennett multiplied, and the paparazzi began camping outside the property with renewed interest. "We need to do something more definitive," Lawrence declared during an emergency meeting in Cameron's office. "The speculation is starting to affect the company's shares again." Regina, who was watching the city through the panoramic window, turned with a determined expression. "How about bringing the wedding forward?" Natalie, who was sitting on the leather sofa, trying to control another wave of morning sickness, raised her head abruptly. "What? It makes sense," Cameron used, his eyes meeting Natalie's with a softness that contradicted the pragmatics of the discussion. "An intimate and elegant wedding, before the pregnancy becomes apparent. And before Michael Bennett causes any more problems," Lawrence added, typing furiously on his tablet. "I have sources who indicate that he is negotiating a book about his relationship with Natalie." The color left her face completely. Cameron immediately moved to her side, a protective hand on her back. "He can't do this without your consent," he assured her. "Actually," Lawrence corrected hesitantly, "if he keeps the names changed and presents it as fiction based on real facts, legally he can." Regina sat in the opposite armchair, her expression softening as she noticed Natalie's discomfort. "Darling, a wedding now would silence a lot of rumors. More importantly, it would give Cameron legal standing to protect you and the baby." Natalie looked at Cameron, finding in his eyes not just determination, but something deeper, something that had grown silently during those farcical weeks and was now blossoming into something genuine. "Do you really want this?" she asked softly. "I want you," he replied simply, causing Regina and Lawrence to exchange meaningful glances. Marriage would just be making official something that is already happening naturally. Before Natalie could reply, Gloria hurried into the office. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see." She turned on the plasma television on the wall, tuning in to a local news channel. Michael Bennett was giving a live interview, his face showing a mixture of hurt and determination. "Natalie Parker and I had plans for our future," he declared to the cameras. Until suddenly, she disappeared. Weeks later, she's engaged to her billionaire boss. The public deserves to know the truth about this fabricated fairy tale. Cameron turned off the TV with an abrupt gesture, his jaw tense with restrained anger. Natalie felt her world spin slightly, and it wasn't just because of her pregnancy. "He's lying," she whispered. "There were never any plans. He made it clear from the start that he didn't want commitment." Regina stood up with the grace of years of social practice, her face a mask of aristocratic determination. "Lawrence, prepare an official statement." Gloria called Verawam. "She owes me a favor." Cameron, "Darling, I think it's time to use that special marriage license we keep for emergencies." "Special license?" Natalie asked, confused. "A courtesy offered to certain influential families," Regina explained with a sly smile. "It allows ceremonies to be performed in urgent circumstances." Cameron knelt in front of Natalie, taking her hands between his. "I know this isn't how you dreamed it would be, and I promise to give you the wedding of your dreams afterwards, with everything you deserve. But now, I need to know, will you marry me? Not for the media, not for Michael, but because you also feel what's growing between us." The silence in the office was palpable. Gloria discreetly wiped away a tear, while Regina held her breath. Even Lawrence had stopped typing, his eyes fixed on the scene that was unfolding. Natalie looked at their entwined hands, at the engagement ring that had started out as a feeder prop and now carried a much deeper meaning. She thought about how Cameron supported her unconditionally, how his touch had become a natural comfort, how her heart raced every time he entered a room. "Yes," she finally answered, her voice broken but firm. "Yes, I accept." The smile that lit up Cameron's face was too genuine for any sham. He pulled her into a tight hug, and for the first time since all the madness had started, Natalie felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Regina was already on the phone, orchestrating the preparations with the efficiency of a general. 3 days, she declared. We can organize everything in 3 days. Lawrence was making frantic notes. I'll prepare an exclusive ad for the New York Times that will set the right tone of legitimacy in class. But Natalie barely heard the practical details being discussed around her. Her eyes were fixed on Cameron, who stared at her as if she were the answer to a question he didn't even know he was asking. Are you all right? He whispered, just for her to hear. I am, she replied, surprised by the truth in his words. For the first time in a long time, I really am. The news of the impending marriage between Cameron Hayes and Natalie Parker exploded in the media like a controlled bomb. Lawrence had masterfully manipulated the leak, ensuring that the narrative favored the couple. The New York Times published an elegant article on the discreet romance that blossomed at Hayes' mansion, complete with a professional photo of the couple in the estate's garden. Natalie watched the wedding preparations as if in a fever dream. Vera Wong personally supervised the fittings of her dress, a delicate ivory model that subtly disguised her expanding waistline. The designer, an old friend of Regina's, had canceled 3 international appointments to attend to the Hayes' urgent request. Something's wrong, Cameron declared on the morning of the day before the wedding, abruptly entering the office where Natalie was going over the last details with the decorating team. What do you mean? She asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. Michael Bennett has disappeared. He canceled all his scheduled interviews and emptied his apartment overnight. Natalie's stomach did a familiar flip, but this time it wasn't due to her pregnancy. Do you think he's planning something? I'm sure, Cameron replied, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. I've increased security for tomorrow, but Mr. Hayes, Lawrence interrupted, hurrying into the room. I've just received some information. Bennett was seen entering the Daily News office an hour ago. Regina, who was supervising the assembly of flowers in the winter garden, joined them with her usual controlled elegance. What else do we know about him? Lawrence consulted his tablet. Apart from the debts and the child support case, we found out that he has a history of emotional blackmail with ex-girlfriends. Apparently, it's a pattern. Natalie felt her legs go weak, and Cameron immediately guided her to the nearest sofa. Why didn't you ever tell me about him? He asked softly, sitting down next to her. Because it embarrassed me, she admitted, tears starting to form. Michael seemed so perfect at first. Intelligent, charming, passionate about literature like me. But then the requests to borrow money started, the inconsistent stories about his past. And when did you find out about the pregnancy? Regina asked gently, taking a seat across from Natalie. He'd already disappeared. He left a message saying he needed space to find himself. I found out later that he had done the same with other women. Cameron held her hand tightly, his eyes sparking with restrained anger. He's not going to ruin our marriage. It's not just the marriage that worries me, Natalie confessed. What if he reveals about the baby? What if, then we'll reveal it first, Regina declared, surprising everyone. On our terms, our way. Lawrence immediately got the idea. An official announcement about the pregnancy, as part of the wedding coverage. We can control the narrative, present it as an unexpected blessing that has only strengthened your love. But the dates, Natalie began. They're irrelevant, Cameron interrupted her gently. This baby is mine, Natalie. Not by biology, but by choice. And I want the world to know that. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Gloria, who had quietly entered with a tray of tea, smiled approvingly. Well, Regina stood up, resuming her role as commander-in-chief. We have a wedding to finalize and an announcement to prepare. Lawrence, work on the official declaration. Gloria, make sure the menu is suitable for a pregnant bride. Cameron, darling, you've got that meeting with the judge in an hour. When everyone left, leaving Cameron and Natalie alone in the office, she finally allowed the tears to fall freely. Are you sure? She asked, her voice trembling. Publicly assuming a child that isn't yours. Cameron pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I'm sure about you. About us. The rest is just details. That night, against all tradition, Cameron insisted on having dinner alone with Natalie in the library. her favorite refuge in the mansion. Among old bookshelves and the comforting scent of books, they shared not just a meal, but their deepest hopes and fears. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "when I say I do, it won't be because of the media, or Michael, or anyone else. It will be because, somewhere between all the cups of tea you brought me during work evenings and all the books we discussed in this library, I fell in love with the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." Natalie felt her heart racing, not from fear or anxiety, but from a deep and unshakable certainty. "And when I say yes," she replied, "it will be because I have finally found not just true love, but a home." The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the library in golden hues through the old windows. Tomorrow, they would face the media, speculation, and whatever drama Michael Bennett tried to create. But at that moment, safe in their sanctuary of books and silent promises, they were just Cameron and Natalie, two hearts that needed a lie to find their deepest truth. The morning of the wedding dawned with a soft mist over Manhattan, enveloping the Hayes mansion in an ethereal veil. Natalie watched the preparations unfold through the window of her suite, where a team of professionals orchestrated by Regina transformed her into the bride that New York society had been waiting to see. "I just got a message from the Daily News," Lawrence announced, hurrying into the room. "Michael Bennett has made his revelations." Natalie's heart raced, but before panic could set in, Regina took the tablet from Lawrence's hands and smiled with satisfaction. "Too late," she declared. "Our statement about the pregnancy is already circulating in all the major media, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive." The makeup artist was putting on the finishing touches when Cameron sent a message. "No matter what happens today, remember that it's real. We are real." The words brought tears to Natalie's eyes, causing the makeup artist to let out an exclamation of concern. Gloria, who was supervising everything in her motherly way, approached with a handkerchief. "No crying yet, darling," she whispered. "Save your tears for when you see your fiancé." The mansion's winter garden had been transformed into an intimate chapel. Only 100 carefully selected guests occupied the chairs decorated with white orchids and silk ribbons. The press, kept at a respectful distance by the security guards, recorded only what they were allowed to see. "Are you ready?" Regina asked, adjusting Natalie's veil one last time. The Vera Wang dress was a dream in motion, its flowing layers perfectly disguising the small curve of her belly. "Almost," Natalie replied, her hand instinctively touching her belly. "I just need a moment." Regina nodded understandingly and left, leaving Natalie alone with her thoughts. The mirror reflected an image she'd barely recognized, not just from the glamour of the dress or the flawless makeup, but from the inner light that seemed to emanate from her. A soft knock on the door interrupted her contemplation. It was Cameron, breaking all traditions again. "I know I'm not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony," he said, entering the room with his eyes closed, "but I needed to hear your voice." Natalie laughed, the sound musical and genuine. "You can open your eyes. I think we've broken enough traditions to last a lifetime." When Cameron saw her, his face transformed with an emotion so pure that it made Natalie's heart skip a beat. "You look perfect," he whispered. "I read the Daily News story," she said softly. "Michael—" "It doesn't matter," Cameron interrupted her, moving closer to hold her hands. "Nothing he says can change what we've built. What we're building." The sound of music starting downstairs signaled that it was time. Cameron kissed her forehead softly and left, leaving Natalie with a certainty that all the headlines in the world couldn't shake. The walk down the aisle was a blur of smiling faces in discreet flashes. Natalie only had eyes for Cameron, who was waiting for her with an expression that mixed reverence and absolute love. The judge began the ceremony with words about commitment and unity, but it was the personal vows that made the truth of their story shine through. "Natalie," Cameron began, his voice firm but charged with emotion, "you came into my life organizing my schedule and tidying up my library. You ended up organizing my heart without me even realizing it. I promised to spend every day of the rest of our lives proving that what started out as a lie has turned into the deepest truth I've ever known." The tears flowed freely down Natalie's face when it was her turn. "Cameron, you offered me protection when I needed it most, But you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a home, a family, and a love that transcends any social convention. I promise to honor not only the man you are, but the family we are building together." When the judge declared them man and wife, the kiss that sealed their union wasn't for the cameras or the guests. It was a moment of absolute truth between two people who needed a lie to find their way to each other. The reception that followed was a triumph of the understated elegance that characterized the Hayes. Regina, impeccable in her role as hostess, ensured that every detail reflected not only the family's social status, but also the true love that everyone could see between the bride and groom. To Cameron and Natalie, Lawrence proposed with a first toast, who turned a headline scandal into a love story for the books. Gloria, serving the cake she had personally prepared, smiled with tears in her eyes. "I always knew," she whispered to Regina, "from the first time I saw how he looked at her when he thought no one was watching." In a quiet moment between dances, Cameron took Natalie out into the garden. Under the soft lights that decorated the trees, he placed his hand on her belly. "Our son," he said with conviction, "no matter what Michael or anyone else says, this is our family." Natalie covered his hand with her own, feeling the new ring on her finger. "Our truth," she agreed softly. The first week of their marriage passed like a dream, interspersed with flashes of reality. Between sensationalist headlines about Michael Bennett's revelations and messages of support from people close to them, Cameron and Natalie found refuge in each other, building their own truth away from the spotlight. The company's shares have risen 5 points since the pregnancy announcement, Lawrence reported over breakfast a week after the wedding. The public loved the story of the CEO taking on the child of the woman he loves. It's being called the modern Manhattan fairy tale. Natalie, who was fighting a particularly strong wave of morning sickness, just nodded. Cameron, sensing her discomfort, discreetly asked Gloria to prepare more ginger tea. "We have a bigger problem," Regina announced, entering the dining room with her iPad. "Michael Bennett has arranged an exclusive interview with Barbara Walters." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Natalie's cup shaking against the saucer. Cameron immediately covered her hand with his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "When?" he asked, his controlled voice masking his anger. "Tomorrow night," Regina replied, taking a seat at the table. "And there's more. Apparently, he has proof, messages, photos, medical documents." Natalie paled. "How'd he get my medical records?" "Your former assistant at the clinic," Lawrence explained, consulting his notes. "She was fired 2 weeks ago for leaking confidential patient information. We're already taking legal action." Cameron stood up abruptly, his chair dragging against the marble floor. "Enough. I won't allow him to continue terrorizing my wife." The word wife still sent a shiver down Natalie's spine, a mixture of surprise and contentment that not even the current situation could completely diminish. "Maybe," she began hesitantly, "maybe I should give my own interview. Tell my side of the story." Regina smiled approvingly. "I was thinking the same thing. Diana Stewart from Vogue called me this morning. She wants to do a cover story with you. The first official interview of the Hayes couple." "Vogue?" Natalie asked, her eyes widening. "But I'm not. I don't know how. You're a Hayes now," Regina interrupted her gently. "And more importantly, you're exactly the kind of strong woman Diana loves to portray." Cameron sat back down, his hand automatically finding Natalie's. "Only if you're completely comfortable with it." At that moment, Gloria entered with a new tray of tea in her famous blueberry muffins, the only ones Natalie had been able to keep in her stomach lately. "If I may say so," the cook said as she served, "sometimes the best defense is to show your truth before others try to distort it." Natalie looked at the ring on her finger, at the small curve of her belly that was starting to become more evident, and finally at Cameron, who was watching her with that unique mixture of protectiveness and adoration that made her heart race. "Okay," she decided. "Let's do it." The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of preparations. Diana Stewart arrived at the mansion with a reduced team: photographer, makeup artist, interpersonal assistant. The interview would be conducted in the library, the place where Cameron and Natalie's story truly began. "Tell me about the first time you realized you were in love," Diana asked, her recorder capturing every word. Natalie hesitated for a moment, looking at the familiar bookshelves. "It was during a storm," she began, surprising even Cameron with her answer. "I was organizing the library, and he was working late, as usual. A particularly strong thunderstorm knocked out the power, and we were stuck here for hours, talking by candlelight about our favorite books, our dreams. That's when you told me about your desire to open a bookshop," Cameron added softly, the memory clearly special to him too. Diana smiled, realizing the genuine connection between them. "What about the baby? How did that affect your relationship?" "The baby," Cameron replied before Natalie could worry, "is a gift. A symbol that family goes far beyond DNA. When Natalie told me about the pregnancy, it only strengthened what I already felt for her." The interview went on for hours, covering topics from the start of their relationship to their plans for the future. When Diana finally left, promising to send a preview of the article before publication, Natalie felt strangely lighthearted. "You were amazing," Cameron whispered, pulling her into his arms as soon as they were alone. "I was honest," she replied, resting her head on his chest. "About us, about how I feel now. The rest is in the past." That evening, while Michael Bennett's interview with Barbara Walters aired, Cameron and Natalie remained in the library, deliberately ignoring the television. Instead, he read aloud passages from Jane Eyre, the book they had discussed that stormy night, when they were both still in denial about what was growing between them. "Some people say there's no happiness in love," Cameron read, his voice soft in the cozy dimness of the library. "But there's more happiness in love than people think." Natalie, nestled against him on the leather sofa, smiled as she felt the baby move for the first time. Taking Cameron's hand, she guided it to her womb, sharing the intimate moment that no interview or headline could adequately capture. "This is our fairy tale," she whispered. "Our truth." The Vogue story was published 3 weeks after the interview, coinciding with the start of Natalie's second trimester of pregnancy. The photos captured intimate moments of the couple in the library of the Hayes mansion, including a particularly touching one where Cameron had his hand on Natalie's already visible belly as they both smiled at each other, oblivious to the camera. "It's surprisingly authentic," Regina commented, leafing through the magazine over breakfast. "Diana managed to capture something that even we didn't realize was happening right under our noses all these years." Natalie, now more comfortable with her morning sickness thanks to Gloria's constant care, watched Cameron read the emails on his tablet. Since the wedding, he had established a new ritual of working a few hours at home before going to the office, always making sure to share breakfast together. Michael's interview with Barbara Walters ended up having the opposite effect to what he expected. Lawrence informed him, entering the dining room with his usual folder of reports. "Social media is slaughtering him. The story of a man trying to destroy a family for revenge didn't go down well with the public." "What about the company's shares?" Cameron asked, although his tone suggested that the answer was secondary to his concern for Natalie. "They've never been better. The market loves a CEO who puts family first." Natalie smiled slightly, remembering how it had all started, an impromptu lie to avoid a scandal turning into the purest truth. Her fingers unconsciously traced the cover of Vogue, where the headline proclaimed, "Manhattan's True Fairy Tale: How Love Rewrote the Rules." "I have a surprise for you," Cameron announced, taking her hand on the table. "Are you up for a little stroll?" Regina smiled knowingly, clearly part of the conspiracy, while Lawrence discreetly checked his watch. "Your first meeting has been rescheduled for after lunch," he assured her. The driver took them through Greenwich Village, finally stopping in front of a charming historic red brick building. An old bookstore occupied the first floor, its dusty windows and faded sign suggesting that the establishment had seen better days. "What's this?" Natalie asked, her heart racing with foreboding. "Your dream," Cameron replied simply, guiding her into the building. "The former owner is retiring after 40 years. The place needs a complete renovation, but it's perfect," Natalie added, marveling at the old wooden shelves that went from floor to ceiling, the wrought iron escalators that led up to the mezzanine, and the natural light that came in through the original stained glass windows. "The apartment above the store is also included," Cameron continued, watching their reactions with evident pleasure. "I thought we could turn it into a space for the baby to play while you work." There's a little garden on the terrace. Natalie turned to face him, tears in her eyes. You bought this for me? For us, he corrected softly. A place that can be ours alone, away from the headlines and expectations. Where our son can grow up surrounded by stories and a love of books, just like his parents. The natural use of the word parents made Natalie's heart expand with emotion. In just a few months, Cameron had become more of a father to his son than Michael would ever be. Not out of obligation or appearances, but out of choice and love. There's one more thing, he said, leading her into what would have been the bookshop's office. On the antique table was an official envelope. Natalie opened it with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the contents. This is adoption papers, Cameron confirmed, for when the baby is born. I want him or her to legally have what they already have in my heart, the right to be a Hayes in every way. Tears were now running freely down Natalie's face. How can you do that? What? Make me love you even more when I already found it impossible to love you more? Cameron pulled her into his arms, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Because every day with you teaches me new ways to love. Because what began as a lie to the press has become the greatest truth of my life. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the couple in soft colors as they stood embraced, surrounded by old books and promises of the future. Outside, Manhattan continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the small miracle unfolding inside that old bookstore. The story of two people who needed a farce to find their deepest truths. Have you thought of a name for the bookshop? Cameron asked softly. Natalie looked around at the endless possibilities that space represented, then smiled. How about chapters? Because every great story needs a beginning. The transformation of the old bookshop into chapters became a project that brought Cameron and Natalie even closer together over the following months. As her belly grew, the dusty bookshelves took on a new shine, and the space took on a personality that perfectly blended vintage charm with modern touches. The nursery in the upstairs apartment is almost ready, Cameron announced one autumn afternoon, finding Natalie organizing a new shipment of children's books. Gloria insists she needs more teddy bears. Natalie smiled, stroking her 7-month-old belly. Our daughter already has more teddy bears than she'll be able to hug in a lifetime. The discovery of the baby's sex had been a particularly exciting moment. Regina immediately began planning a trousseau fit for a Hayes princess, while Gloria started a collection of traditional recipes to make little Emma grow up strong. The name had been chosen during a quiet evening in the mansion's library. Emma, like the heroine of Jane Austen, the author who had brought Cameron and Natalie together in so many conversations over the years. I have some news about Michael, Cameron said softly, helping Natalie to sit down in one of the newly restored vintage armchairs. He's accepted an editorial position in London. Lawrence confirmed that he's leaving next week. Natalie processed the information in silence. After the failure of his media campaign against the Hayes, Michael had retreated, especially after the Vogue article generated an overwhelming wave of support for the couple. How do you feel about this? Cameron asked, his hand naturally finding hers. At peace, she replied after a moment. It's like a difficult chapter is finally closing, making room for our real story to begin. The doorbell rang, announcing Regina's arrival with more shopping bags for the baby. You have to see what I found at Burdorf's, she exclaimed, her first-time grandmother enthusiasm evident. Mom, I thought we agreed to cut back on the shopping. Cameron tried to sound serious, but his smile betrayed him. Nonsense. Regina dismissed the comment with an elegant gesture. My first granddaughter deserves the best. Besides, we need to discuss the details of the baby's shower. Natalie exchanged an amused glance with Cameron. The little tea that Regina had planned had turned into a socially noteworthy event, with exclusive coverage in Vogue. Diana Stewart had practically begged to do the story, enchanted by the couple's history. Speaking of events, Lawrence commented, entering the bookstore with his inseparable briefcase. The official opening of chapters is confirmed for next month. The New York Times will be doing a special report on family entrepreneurship. Family, Natalie repeated softly, the word carrying a special weight. In less than a year, her life had been completely transformed. From lonely, pregnant housekeeper to beloved wife and future owner of her own bookshop, a change that seemed straight out of the pages of the novels she loved so much. Cameron, sensing her excitement, pulled her closer. "Everything okay?" "Better than okay," she replied, guiding her hand to where Emma was kicking energetically. "Just realizing how sometimes the best stories are the ones we don't plan." Regina, who was watching the scene with watery eyes, discreetly signaled to Lawrence, and they both left the couple alone. Gloria, who arrived with a tray of tea and cookies, smiled knowingly and also left. "You know," Cameron began, his voice soft in the intimacy of the moment, "when I improvised that engagement announcement that night, I was only trying to protect your reputation. I had no idea that I was actually saving myself." "What do you mean?" "I lived surrounded by people, but completely alone, focused only on numbers, contracts, and appearances. You changed that long before we got married, Natalie. Every cup of tea you brought me during evenings at work, every discussion about literature, every small gesture of care, you saved me little by little, without me even realizing it." Natalie felt tears forming in her eyes. "And you gave me much more than protection or status, Cameron. You gave me a home, a family, and a love that transcends any social convention." The afternoon sun streamed in through the bookshop's restored stained glass windows, creating colorful patterns on the wooden floor. The freshly polished shelves exuded that characteristic scent of books and endless possibilities. In a few weeks, the space would be full of readers, and the apartment above would echo with Emma's crying and laughter. "I think I understand now," Natalie continued, looking around the bookshop that represented the realization of her dream. "Why the best novels always have unexpected twists and turns. It's in the surprises that we find our deepest truths." Cameron smiled, that smile that was reserved only for her. "And what is your deepest truth, Miss Hayes?" "That sometimes we need a lie to find our way to the truths. That family is much more than blood, and that love, when it's real, transcends any story we could have planned." Emma chose that moment to deliver a particularly hard kick, making them both laugh. Cameron knelt in front of the armchair, talking directly to Natalie's belly. "Your mother's right, little one. The best stories are the ones we write with our hearts, not with reason." Outside, Manhattan continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the small miracle unfolding inside that vintage bookshop in Greenwich Village. The story of two people who, through an improbable lie, found their deepest and most enduring truth. And so, between old books and new promises, between the past that united them and the future they were building together, Cameron and Natalie Hayes continued to write their own story. One that proved that the best fairy tales are not those that begin with "once upon a time," but those that are born from the most unexpected truths of the heart.